Good evening and welcome to The Right Side, the show where we talk about today's news, views, trends, and opinions from an admittedly conservative perspective. I'm your host, Chris Pareja, and this evening I'm joined by Pete Hegseth. He's a Fox News contributor, an author, a veteran, all-around good guy. Pete, welcome to the show.
Chris, I'll take that. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So tell us, we'll start with great guy and work backwards. Tell us a little bit about your background and
Sure.
let's get to know you.
Yeah, I was born and raised in Minnesota, small town, great family, patriotic, faith, conservative, generally speaking. But and I grew up wanting to do nothing but play basketball, and I went to college to play basketball, but then I sat on the bench for 4 years, so I was never destined to be in the NBA. But I found conservatism there, I ran a publication there, and then I got involved with ROTC, and that was kind of my path into the military. Did a couple of tours after that, and ran some veterans advocacy organizations as well. And now find myself as doing a little bit of commentating on television from an admittedly conservative perspective as well, and just wrote a book. So I don't really know what I want to be when I grow up. I just know that I want to serve this country as best I can, and I've had a pleasure of doing that in the military. Right,
but you haven't, we were joking before the show that you started out in the ROTC and you went into the military, but you were actually fighting battles before that because it wasn't just any university you were going to.
Yeah, no, I went to Princeton University, and I was the editor or the publisher of the Princeton Tory, which is the conservative publication there. And so, yeah, when I meet people who I graduated with, I say, do you like me or do you hate me? Because I'm not really sure. Because when you're a conservative on a liberal campus like that, you're going to test your mettle. And so I did learn to stand up for what I believed in. What the scary part is, though, campuses today have become so resistant to free speech and some of the ideas. I feel like half the things we said then would have gotten me kicked off campus today.
Right.
It's a totally different environment.
And so, but knowing that that would be a threat in college campuses and you've escaped from there, you're not holding back, you're going after things like Fox News and other places where you're continuing to...
I think it's prepared me a great deal, because when you have to adamantly face-to-face, and when you're younger, to defend ideas that you believed in, and then, frankly, there were a number of moments when I was confronted with a very well-informed left-wing perspective that I didn't have an answer to as a 20-year-old kid who went to public school and had a faith and a belief but wasn't overly political. Mm-hmm. Have to go to the library or go to the internet and say, why do I believe what I believe? Or what does the Constitution say about that? Or what does my faith say about that? It taught me a lot, because I had to defend it without really any other support. And when you learn it, then you really know why you believe it.
And you've actually run for office as well, which also tests your mettle at another level.
Yeah, I ran for the U.S. Senate. When I came back from Afghanistan, I ran for the U.S. Senate in Minnesota. And I kind of came back from Afghanistan, tried to bum rush the process with good fundraising numbers and a lot of media attention. And we did well out the gate. But right now, there's a lot of talk about caucuses at the presidential level. Minnesota is a caucus system. And frankly, the guy who beat me had a very good organization. It was the Ron Paul moment, and he was a favorite of the Ron Paul crowd. And so by the time we got to the convention, he had 60% of the delegates already wrapped up, and it was, by the third ballot, I was toast. So it was a incredible learning experience. Learned a lot about how it happens, how to make the argument, how to anticipate the way they're going to come at you. You learn how nasty politics can be when they come after you. But it was worth doing, and I would take a look at it again if it was the right moment.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about, in the political cycle, how things are one way and the media presents them one way, but you've actually had on-the-ground experience seeing some of the things that are controversial. For example, being inside Guantanamo Bay. Yeah. And we hear in the media this is such a cruel and unusual place. There are all of these things happening. The prisoners are horribly treated and everything else, but you saw a slightly different perspective when you were there.
A very different perspective. So I was there in 2004 and 2005 as a guard. We weren't the military police walking the blocks, but we were kind of on the towers and the gates, the traffic control points. We were the QRF if things really went wrong, transfer detainees from there to the airfield. And when I was there were about 650 detainees. It was full, more or less. Now there's only 90. And even then, in 2004 and 2005, they were excellent conditions for the detainees. They were well taken care of, religious observances, same health care as the guards were getting, the types of meals that were observant of their Muslim faith. It was, even then I could very confidently say we treat these guys very, very well. Now, thankfully, at Fox News Channel, they give me a chance to report on some of these things as someone who has had a firsthand experience. So I just went back down to Guantanamo Bay about 6 weeks ago and reported on it. Now there's only 90, as I said. They're in a Supermax facility down there, and it's amazing. I mean, they've got top-notch world-quality health care. Most of them, if they have health problems, it's obesity because they're fed so well. They've got all the observant items they could want. They're indoor-outdoor, so they can go inside or outside 23 hours a day. They get 300 satellite channels, and they can pick of two different TVs on wireless headphones, a full library, DVDs, video games. These guys are well taken care of, and this administration says they want to close it because of its propaganda value. There's no propaganda value right now to closing Guantanamo. If we close it, you know who's going to get the propaganda win? The bad guys, the Islamists, who can say we forced their hand and got them to close it.
Well, but at least, I mean, this has got to be, they're buried in canisters under the ground when they're getting their 300 cable channels, right? This old facility, 110 years old.
Yeah, that's what's amazing, because I didn't know how it necessarily compared to civilian facilities as well. So I asked the commander there, and who had been a part of facilities in the United States, how does it compare? He said, it's the best prison I've ever seen. He said, it's top-notch, world-class. It's clean. The protocols are top-notch. So a lot
new
of talk,
cement.
Yeah, but it's all brand new and well taken care of and well staffed and well funded, and you don't have mixing populations, and you don't have other vulnerabilities that you would have stateside here in the United States if we were to bring them here. It's an isolated area in Cuba controlled by the U.S. government. There's a ton of advantages to that location, yet the left is just ideologically and politically obsessed with closing it and putting these detainees either back into home countries where they're going back to the battlefield, or, yeah, let's bring them amongst our own population here. It just doesn't strike me as the best idea.
Well, and it sounds so uncompassionate to actually want to lower the standard of living for these prisoners by putting them in regular facilities.
I appreciate you having such a heart for them.
It's all about compassion.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, for sure.
I know that about you. No, it's amazing, because I had a guard who, one of the members of my platoon was a Coptic Christian, an Egyptian. And so I would sit with him in the towers some nights, and we would just listen and observe. You'd see the classes of different detainees. You'd have the Afghans, kind of lighter skinned, and then you had the Arabs, darker skinned. There's definitely a hierarchy, and he would interpret for me. And let's just say that they're not saying nice things, and they're not saying nice things about America or what they want to do to the guards. If they learned the name of a guard, they would repeat it time and time again and say, I'm going to find you, I want to find your family. This, after to the military police, they're throwing cocktails of feces and urine and semen. I mean, it just, they're nasty. They want, and that's why you see 30% of them going back to the battlefield as a minimum with a recidivism rate. Others clearly continue to be sympathetic, and the worst of the worst are there right now. So you think if we let them go, they're going to go back and start a school? Probably not.
Not unless they're burying something under it.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, but it's one of those scenarios. It's the truth versus the emotion.
Yes.
And so you're contributing regularly to Fox. Talk to us about the kinds of programs you're involved in, the kinds of things you're getting to see there and cover.
I'm learning as I go. I've been a contributor for a couple of years, and even before that, my job was to kind of comment on vets issues, military issues, national security, foreign policy, things that I had seen, a lot about Iraq and Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And more recently, they've just been affording me other and additional opportunities. Had the opportunity to do some guest hosting on Fox and Friends, which is the morning show out of New York. It's a little early here. It's live there at 6 a.m., so it's on from 3 to 6 out here in California. So I think the viewership's a little slimmer out here than it is on the East Coast for
Fox News people don't watch as much out here generally, so it's probably okay.
So, no, it's a wonderful opportunity, and I have 3 hours of live TV, so I'm learning as we go, from a serious segment about ISIS to cooking, your mom's stew. I mean, and then a segment about shopping deals.
Right.
It's interesting. But then I also am on the Kelly File and Outnumbered, which is kind of the view for Fox, with the 4 intelligent, beautiful ladies with one lucky guy in the middle talking about the news of the day for an hour.
And your name is Lucky.
And my name is Lucky.
Yes.
I have had the good fortune of doing it many times, and it's a lot of fun. You do the same thing. First show I ever did was we did a bunch of hard news, and then the last segment is, why does my wife love her shoes more than she loves me? And so I called my wife and I said, why does she fantasize about her shoes? So I called my wife and she said, you know what, it's true, there's this pair of blue snakeskin pumps that I've been fantasizing about for a couple of weeks. I said, when's the last time you fantasized about? No, okay, let's leave it right there. And I get off the show and I get a call from a number I don't recognize, and I just decided to answer it. And it was my brigade commander from Iraq. saying, did I just see one of my platoon leaders talking about high heels on national television? So worlds colliding all over the place. But
I thought it was Nordstrom calling to offer you a sponsorship pair of shoes.
Nordstrom, if you're watching, I'm all in for that.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's amazing. I'm learning. It's fun. And what I love about it the most is the ability to give voice. Humbly, so many have done so much more than I have. But as someone who served in Iraq and Afghanistan and Guantanamo Bay, who's seen a big part of the post 9/11 generation, both there and here, to give a little bit of voice to what the trigger pullers are seeing, to what's actually happening on the ground, to what our veterans are facing. And I get the most satisfaction out of an email or a phone call or a Facebook message or a text that I get after that saying, thank you for saying that. Thank you for channeling what I feel. That's exactly what I've seen. And I've had the good fortune now of kind of becoming a magnet for people saying, hey, have you heard about this? Have you seen this? This is going on. This is what I'm facing. And I treat that responsibility very seriously. If I can bring voice to some of that and expose people to what's really going on, I think that's part of the service.
And you're a heavy advocate for veterans in the first place, including lobbying and trying to get bills passed to make sure that they're cared for. So this is important stuff for you.
It really is. And originally, for me, it was around the battlefield, and it still is. I mean, my heart and soul is on our defense of our nation and national security and America's role in the world. It's a big part of what I write about in the book as well. But more recently, with advocacy efforts, it's been around fixing the VA, which continues to be bureaucratic, single-payer, government-run health care for our veterans. And it didn't work 2 years ago. Hasn't worked for decades, but it didn't work 2 years ago when the scandal started, when most people started to realize about the manipulation of secret lists and wait lists. But here we are 2 years later, and very little has changed for veterans on the ground or in Washington. And it's been really a lesson for me about how you try to make change, and I think we've had some successes, but really how powerful the status quo is. Even in the veterans space, where it's supposed to be nonpartisan and everyone's supposed to agree, whether it's the White House or the VA bureaucracy or the government unions, or frankly a lot of other veterans groups who are wedded to the existing system, the status quo is powerful. And when you go there to try to change it, you don't make a lot of friends, even if it's vets issues.
Right.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the book. It's called In the Arena. Tell us a little bit about what the book's about.
Yeah, so the book's called In the Arena, and it is Teddy Roosevelt. It's a Teddy Roosevelt quote called the Man in the Arena quote that's always spoken to me about. It's not the critic who counts, it's the man who's in the arena, whose face is marred by blood and sweat and dust. And if he fails while daring greatly. And the quote goes on. I carried it with me in Iraq and Afghanistan and Guantanamo Bay in a frame, and I always loved the quote because it motivated me. And then one day I read the actual speech that he gave in 1910 called Citizenship in a Republic. And he gave it to a French audience in between his Republican presidency and before he descended into sort of the Progressive Party and Bull Moose candidacy and some of the mistakes that Teddy Roosevelt made that gave us Woodrow Wilson and other things. But the speech really spoke to me because I felt like it is exactly what America needs to hear today. The centerpiece of the speech was citizenship. What does citizenship mean? And that great republics can only stay great if they have good citizens, citizens that understand what makes that great republic special. And if you look around at our politics today and our country today, we're missing a lot of that. And there's a lot of chanting and finger pointing and slogans and protesting, but not enough of the basic citizenship like he talks about, which is hard work, the willingness to fight, either on the battlefield or in the arena of ideas, strong, healthy families, character, being efficient, just basic things that as individuals we can do to be better citizens in this country. So I make the argument about citizenship here at home and then leadership on the world stage, that if America isn't the leader of the world, who's it going to be? And I know there's a lot of people frustrated about America as the world's policeman or whatever you want to call it. But if we were to step back and not be the leaders of the world, who will it be? And I don't think there's anyone that has a good answer that would increase freedom in this world. So we've got to be intentional about where and when we use our force and how we use our military. But we shouldn't be ashamed that America is the beacon of freedom in the world, that it is up to us to be the guarantor of that. And we do need to maintain the most strongest military. So I tell some stories from Iraq and Afghanistan, but it's most certainly not a biography. It's not about my life. It's meant to make an argument about the future of our country and really be, I hope, be a call to arms for people to say, how can I do more? How can I be a good citizen? How can I get in the arena?
And proper disclaimer, call to arms does not mean that you're endorsing the militia or asking people to...
A civic call to arms.
Thank you for clarification.
Yes.
Don't want to upset anybody.
You got it.
So the question that I would have is, you just talked about the strength of the military and how that's important. And one of the topics you'll be covering tonight at the forum is about whether or not the military is still being positioned to win wars or whether it's being used for something else.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. The topic tonight is winning wars or socially engineering. And on one of the, in addition to sort of a gutting of the military, reductions in military spending, we've got the smallest army we've had since 1940, smallest navy since 1915, the smallest air force we've ever had. So you feel that real shrinking, unfortunately, of the military. You also have a different agenda, a different use of it. We have a military that is supposed to be there to fight and win wars. Different types of wars, right? Conventional wars are the types that we used to fight more often. More recently, the types that I've seen have been asymmetric counterinsurgencies that we fight a shadowy enemy who goes underground. You've got to have the ability to do both. And doing that requires readiness and troops and training and technology and tech. That's what the military is supposed to be focused on. What's the threat? How do we build a military to address that threat? It's pretty straightforward. With this administration, you see time and time again a priority on social justice in the military. This idea that it needs to be a fairer place, a kinder place, a safer place. And it started with the biggest issue they took on first was Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which, hey, a lot of people feel like that was a bad policy. That's fine. But for them, it wasn't about war fighting, it was about social justice. Same with women in the military, which I think is much more of a point of contention, because there are certain combat roles, as an infantryman myself in an all-male unit, where it does create complications. And that's not to say that women aren't great soldiers. I serve with amazing soldiers on the battlefield who were involved in combat situations. But there's very few combat, especially infantry leaders, that you would find that would say, I want to introduce that variable. And the problem is the folks that are for that will always say, well, as long as the standards are the same, then what's the big deal? And I basically agree with that argument, even though there are other variables and problems why you don't need men and women in the same foxhole in complicated situations. I just don't trust that the Pentagon bureaucracy, especially in this White House, won't start changing standards. You're already hearing words like gender neutrality, which leads you to believe standards will become the same, but they probably will become the same by them coming down a little bit for men and up for women. There's a lot of real concerns there. So it becomes, what happens is also you have a filtration of generals in leadership who are either war fighters or more politically inclined and willing to do the White House's bidding. And so you start to see a filtering out, a silting out of the war fighters. So whether it's Mattis or Petraeus or McChrystal or a guy like Colonel Steele, who was my brigade commander in Iraq, a lot of the war fighters have been pushed out. And what you get is house cats making their way up to the White House that will do what the White House wants, even if it's not necessarily in the best interest. And I think one of the best demonstrations that this is happening is the way he's sort of gone through secretaries of defense, from Gates to Panetta to Hagel, all of which said it's overly political. Power is concentrated in the White House. It's very focused on social justice and diversity, and less so, and it's all about ending wars as opposed to finishing them properly. And a lot of what I read about in the book also is what happened in Iraq, that the decisions that were made to abandon that war had massive implications. It was kind of a fake surge in Afghanistan, unfortunately, when we surged and then told the enemy when we were going to leave at the same time. That's not how you fight and win wars. So the conversation we're going to have at the forum is, how do we restore that fighting spirit inside a military in a world where threats are unfortunately only gathering?
Oh, I thought we were in a more peaceful, friendly, kinder place. It's not like people are attacking military bases on our own soil. It's not like there are terrorist plots around the world, not just in the U.S.
Yeah.
I mean, none of that stuff's happening anyway.
No,
right?
It's not. And don't worry, they're not Islamists either.
No.
And they don't have a state, so don't call them the Islamic State. It's so frustrating for those of us, and for the general public that's informed, who have seen this enemy, to have a White House that is so obstinate and unwilling to even just name the enemy. Because until you name the enemy, you can't identify the nature of the threat. Right. It's so much of what Europe sees right now with the migrant crisis and sort of a quiet infiltration of those communities where now there's haven for radical Islamists. It's a real problem. And it's another part of what I talk about in the book is we have to recapture who we are and what we believe. Because if we don't know what we can believe, then it's hard to push back on whether it's radical Islamists or authoritarian regimes or globalists who want to use international institutions to sort of take away our sovereignty. You better know who you are. Otherwise, a lot of these utopian ideas start to sound kind of good. And that's what's happening in Western Europe, where they've abandoned their militaries to pay for their welfare states. I don't want America to look like that. And that's the reason I wrote this book. That's the reason I do what I do. I love this country, what it has given all of us for 240 years. And if we don't fight for it in our generation, then what are we leaving for our kids?
craters, probably.
Yeah, I mean, massive, gathering threats. That, in fact, one of the arguments our organization made, Vets for Freedom, in 2008, during the Iraq surge and the Iraq War, is, and George W. Bush made the same argument: finish it now, or our kids will be back fighting an even more vicious enemy. Quite literally, that was the quote President Bush used in the Rose Garden when I was standing there on a press conference with him in 2007. And he was told, he's been proven 100% correct. We viciously and violently defeated al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2007 and 2008. They were obliterated. Joe Biden in 2011 said it was one of the biggest victories that we've had, and it'll be a victory for the administration. Then they abandoned it. And then they abandoned a red line in Syria at the same time and created a perfect cocktail for Islamists to take it over. And when you look at a generation that fought and gave so much for that, and then to hear on the presidential level, all you hear is a very superficial conversation that Bush lied or bring them all home, Iraq was a disaster, it is counterfactual. Iraq was won. Iraq was a success. Imagine if Iraq was a stable place today with an allied country that was an example in the region. That's what we need. And other than Israel, we don't have that anywhere in the Middle East. We had it, and we gave it away. And so we've got to learn those lessons, which is part of what I talk about as well, without throwing the baby out with the bathwater on a war like Iraq.
Well, without giving away the punchline, 3 points that you would bring up to fix the problem.
I think to fix the overall problem in our country today, the 3 points that I focus on, and I provide some specific examples of some modest policy proposals. I'm a conservative across the board. I didn't try to write a conservative book about everything because I wanted to keep it focused on what I thought was important and what I think Roosevelt was addressing in that speech. So it's intentional citizenship. It's reminding kids and our country what it represents, teaching it, infusing it, and then teaching people that it isn't just voting once every 4 years and doing jury duty. It's intentionally being a part of your community, your church, your sports teams, your civic duties, joining the military, whatever it is to be a part of this country. And then the other part is equal opportunity. I think as conservatives, we have to fiercely guard equal opportunity. We're not the equal outcome party. That's the left. They want the equal outcomes. We should be focused on making sure that every American has an opportunity to succeed, and we're focused on whether it's families or education or opportunities in the workforce, that we're creating an environment where opportunity is fostered. And Roosevelt was very passionate about that, and I am as well, because you see today the left wants to talk about with wealth redistribution and a lot of the what's the word they use? It's all economic fairness. We need to be talking about social mobility and the ability for people to rise out of any circumstance. And there are a lot of people stuck in their conditions right now, whether it's debt or the cost of student loans or wages not rising. There's real problems. We need to have a conversation using solutions from today as opposed to just what they've always been. And then the final one is leadership, American leadership, restoring our military.
And just going back to the other one, not only looking at the symptoms, but addressing the root causes of what those were, which are often those things that, through all well-meaning, were put into place that gave people the crutches to put them in the debt and the student loans and everything else.
100%. So you create a dependency culture, trying to do good, and then you fix people in that situation. I also think we have to have the integrity to call out the cronyism that exists at the top and not just the bottom. And we get pigeonholed as the party that protects the rich guys. Well, I'm not rich. I'm not here to protect the wealthy. They should play by the same rules as everybody else. And when there's cronyism at the top or bailouts at the top, we need to get rid of that and be willing to do away with that, because the little guy doesn't get that, and they see a stacked system that's weighted against them. The left does a good job exploiting that through emotion. There's ways we can point that out and attack it also.
We have to cut to a break in just a moment, but do you have a website where people can find out more about you?
They can go to PeteHegseth.com, the bio, book information, things like that.
Great. Thanks for joining us, Pete. If you hold on for just a moment,
you got it.
We'll be back after a word from our underwriters, the Conservative Forum.
Some people think that a meeting of conservatives in Silicon Valley could fit in a small room. In fact, when the Conservative Forum was founded in 2003, we did meet in a small room, a coffee shop in San Jose. It doesn't get more grassroots than this. It may surprise you that there are thousands of people right here in Silicon Valley who share your principles of liberty, free markets, and limited government. Since our humble beginnings in that coffee shop, we've outgrown 3 meeting halls. From San Jose to Gilroy to Mill Valley, we bring hundreds of people together each month from all over the Bay Area to promote the principles of American liberty. How do we do it? It starts with a stellar lineup of speakers. Speakers like Steve Forbes, Senator Jim DeMint, Dr. Victor Davis Hanson, Lieutenant Colonel Alan West, Andrew Breitbart, Pamela Geller, and many others. These speakers passionately articulate our shared principles and remind us why conservatism isn't just the smart choice, it's also the moral choice. Our monthly meetings are only one dimension of the forum. We underwrite The Right Side, a monthly television show on cable access channel KMVT. We also host a monthly Constitution discussion group and provide tables at our meetings for more than a dozen local groups who share our love of liberty to promote their specific cause. The Conservative Forum is the premier place in Silicon Valley for conservatives to gather, become invigorated, motivated, and empowered. We welcome guests to our monthly meetings and offer special discounted pricing to first-time visitors. Take a look at our speaker lineup in the coming months and join us to learn why we say liberty is made in America.
And welcome back to The Right Side. That was a word from our underwriters, the Conservative Forum. We appreciate them tremendously for keeping this show on the air for this is now the 5th season, so the last 4 years. But what they're best known for is their speaker series. And that was the reason we were blessed with having Pete in the studio this evening. He'll be the speaker this evening at 7:30 at the IFES Portuguese Hall at 432 Stearland Road, right around the corner from here in Mountain View. In May, John Eastman, faculty member of the Chapman University Law School since '99, will be speaking. He serves as the chairman of the board of the National Organization for Marriage. And then in June, Yaron Brook will be returning as he's the executive director of the Ayn Rand Institute and co-author of Free Market Revolution, How Ayn Rand's Ideas Can End Big Government. Sounds like a recurring theme here on this show, the end of big government. And speaking of that, we just appreciate Pete tremendously for being here this evening. And I'm biased, but I believe everything he said to be true because I agree with it. But if you want to learn more about Pete, do look him up on the web at PeteHegseth.com. You can find out more about In the Arena, his Fox News commentary, and the other things he's up to change the world and bring a conservative perspective. This has been The Right Side. I've been your host, Chris Pareja, and we've enjoyed having you here with us this evening. We'll look forward to seeing you in person or on the show again sometime soon. But if you just can't wait, reach out to us at therightsidetv@gmail.com, and we'll try to get back to you as quickly as possible. Thanks again. Have a great evening. See you soon.